unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. If there is one thing political scientists can agree on, it is that we live in an era of populism. With the recent election of Donald Trump, populism has returned to the United States, and it's raised questions about what changes we might see in upcoming elections in 2025. South Asia has been no stranger to populism, and a new book, Righteous Demagogues, Populist Politics in South Asia and Beyond, provides a framework for understanding its origins, its evolution, and its prospects. The authors of this new book are the scholars Adnan Naseemullah and Pradeep Chhibber. Dann is a reader in international politics at King's College London, and Pradeep is professor of political science and the Indo-American Community Chair in India Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. They joined me today to talk more about their book, and I'm pleased to welcome them both to the show for the very first time. Dann and Pradeep, congrats on the book and welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Milan.
So Pradeep, let me start with you, and I want to pick up on something that you mentioned actually in the acknowledgments, which is that this book began in earnest in the depths of the COVID pandemic during a long walk that the two of you took in Golden Gate Park, not far from Berkeley in January 2021. Tell us a bit about this walk and the book's origin story.
I think there were a few things that are fermenting in our head for quite some time. And I think all of that came to fruition during COVID, when I don't know if you recall, but we were all feeling a sense of helplessness, which is that, we had no idea what was going on. And as I started reflecting on our feelings, and I started thinking a little bit also about my interviews with a large number of Indian politicians in the years before that, I realized that in India, and mostly in South Asia, and even then in the United States, what we are getting over the years is the emergence of what Dan and I have come to call a sense of political inequality, in which normal citizens are feeling gradually disempowered, not only by the instruments of the state, but by these extremely large corporations that seem to be running most of our lives. And some of this was also spurred by, I think, an amazing article we read in the New Yorker on what happens to a trailer park when hedge funds take over a trailer park. So in other words, what we both sense, and maybe it was just the psychological feeling of being in the COVID era, that there was a sense of powerlessness in the face of these large institutions that were standing in front of us. And we then started reflecting on the speeches given by Modi and Trump, and how both of them were in some senses promising, at least Modi in 2014 and Trump in 2016 notably, were promising a return of power to the people. And that, to me, was what, it was a combination of those things, both personal as well as, more academic, that spurred the conversation and started us to think about populism more generally.
So, Dan, when we talk about populism, we hear a lot about populism. It might be one of the most popular concepts in our political discourse, but it's also one that is oftentimes ill-defined, right? People kind of use it. They think everyone understands the context in which they're using it, but in fact, everyone is kind of working off a very different definition, right? For the benefit of our listeners, tell us a little bit about how you and Pradeep in the book kind of trying to wrestle populism to the ground, right? How do you kind of define it and imagine it?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the frustrations as we were going into this and trying to figure out what exactly we were studying, it came down to the idea that a lot of the scholarship is kind of messy because people are essentially incorporating their explanations into their definitions. And we were sort of getting more and more frustrated with that, such that in the end, what we ended up doing was just Googling it. And Google came up with a beautiful definition that reflects a lot of different things, including actually important strains in the scholarship. So I'm just going to read again from Google here. Populism is a political approach that strives to appeal to ordinary people who feel that their concerns are disregarded by established elite groups. And really, at the very heart of that is about the distinction between who ordinary people are versus out of touch establishments, elites, things like that. And the idea that there are some politicians who are trying to craft their claims to appeal to those people while noticing that there are these elites who are sort of disregarding them. And really inbuilt in that is a notion of political inequality, that some people have much more sort of access to the state, to political resources, and even to discourse than others.
And actually, to carry on, to make this personal, actually, we actually were also thinking of a definition of populism. And I've said that this is footnoted in the book, but I was trying to be a good father, and I was driving my daughter home, and I was trying to tell her what I do, just so that she, just to build a relationship. And she looked at me and she said, "Dad, but your definition is presuming your outcomes."
Wow. Pretty perceptive daughter.
And the moment she said that, I realized that a lot of definitions of populism, you presume the outcome and you use that definition then to discuss what populism is. So that's when Dan and I decided that what we need to do is come up with a common definition that would generally be acceptable and work off of that to explain what's happening in South Asia.
One of the core arguments of the book, Pradeep, is that populist politics has these multiple elements, right? And in your narrative, it has 3 elements. And what I like about this book so much is that it's very elegant, right? I mean, it's very structured, it's very intuitive. The 3 elements of populist politics that you refer to are, number 1, a crisis of representation. Number 2, the invocation of some kind of moral contract and perhaps the breaking down or the decay of that contract. And number 3, a kind of typology of populist politics that are based on the nature of the representational crisis. And I wonder if you could just tell us a bit more about each of those elements that comprise populism.
The impulse of this is the democratic impulse, which comes in some senses out of Margaret Conman's amazing article, which speaks of democracy as redemptive to some extent. And what she says is that democracy has a redemptive quality to it. And what we find when we say political crisis of representation, what we are saying is that there are people in society who feel that the political class is no longer representing their interests. But that is something that is common to democratic politics across the world. Normal day-to-day democratic politics has an element of a crisis of representation built into it. Because if we were being perfectly represented, we would not ever have a crisis at all. And there would be no need for populism or democratic conflict even. So the idea is that because there is this crisis of representation, in this case, it's a very particular crisis of representation. And the particularity arises out of the belief that there is a class of politicians who are just interested in themselves. Now, that can take on multiple forms. It can take in the form of day-to-day populists, whom we call quotidian populists, because if you think much politics in South Asia and across the world is a particular group that feels aggrieved that the political class generally is not looking after their interests. The second class of populists is what we call additive populists, whose support lies in a well-established social group, such as Narendra Modi's support in upper caste Hindutva politics. And what they do is through their rhetoric, and I'll get to the moral contract in a minute, try and build a larger coalition And finally is, I think, what we call the reordering populists who completely shake up the system. What's interesting about these things is that first, most populists are not reordering. We have this image in our head, thanks to some extent because of Trump, which is somewhat misleading in both Dan and my perspective, is that they are the normal day-to-day populists. Most populists are not, if you will call the reordering populists who come and change the system completely, number one. Number two, most of those populists who are actually powerful populists are actually people who are day-to-day politicians. So if you think of Nayib Bukele in El Salvador or AMLO in Mexico, these are people who've been through the mill, or even Orban in Hungary. These are people who've been through the political mill, and therefore what they have realized is that, listen, populism is a political strategy, and I can invoke this political strategy, and to have a successful political strategy, I need to tap into what Dan and I call the moral contract, which is when the state became, in the South Asian case, when the state became independent, what did it promise people? In the South Asian case, we argue, the state promised a level of political equality, and the state did not deliver on that political equality. And that is the message that they propose, and that is the message that resonates with people so that they can build these large coalitions, depending on how many people they can appeal to. In South Asia, we've had remarkably successful reordering populists as well, and I think the best example of them is N.T. Ramarao, who in Andhra Pradesh just came in and within 9 months completely annihilated the existing political parties, essentially, and lots of people have argued this, by playing that the needs of the Andhra people were being completely disregarded by the political class sitting in Delhi. That's how we managed to actually build a large coalition. And that's a rare in the South Asian case, but that's a good example of it.
So just to kind of dig into this, Pradeep, if I can ask you a follow-up. I mean, you had referenced Narendra Modi as an additive populist. But is there a distinction between the Narendra Modi of 2014 and, say, the Narendra Modi of 2019 and 2024 in terms of which populist kind of bucket or category he falls into?
So we argue in the book that he was a populist in 2014. By 2019, he was no longer a populist. By 2019, and this argument depends on, we need to make, and I think Dan and I agree on this, that often in newspapers and in academic writing, we mistake populist and popular. Populism is that there is an elite who is acting in its own self-interest and is therefore disregarding the interests of the masses. What the BJP did post-2014 and post-2019 is popular politics. That's the first thing, which means they started, for example, giving out, welfare schemes, cooking gas, etc. Those are extremely popular measures. You're not in any way threatening the underlying distribution of power, which is what a populist says they would do. So both Dan and I are quite clear in the book that populism is a political strategy that by and large, in most cases, in some cases it doesn't, but in most cases it ends once the election is over. Once the election is over, Modi has now to govern because he is now the elite. And at that point, as Rahul Verma and I have written, and you've written as well, is that by 2019, the message has moved, like with populists everywhere else in the world, to a darker Hindu majoritarian politics. And it's quite clear that by 2019, that's what's driving his success. Is nationalism and Hindutva politics.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, a lot of the arguments and the claims and the stories that Modi told in 2014 was about a moral redemption against corruption, to govern India in a much more honest way in terms of criticizing the sort of out-of-touch elite establishment of the UPA regime, all of its corruption, all of its scandals. And so the actual language of that campaign was really focused on that. Now, once he comes into power, what does he do? The Notebandi, the sort of demonetization, which was all about these sort of questions of going against sort of the dark forces of terrorist finance and things like that. There's some of the GST, but most of the time, the kinds of appeals that got him into power in 2014 cannot be replicated because, again, India is not noticeably much better governed in 2018 coming up to it. And so then the appeals themselves had to change a little bit, if that makes sense.
So Dan, let me just we're sort of putting the cart before the horse a little bit. Let's rewind a second and kind of go back to the independence moment. Because the book really is about what is happening in South Asia. Particularly, you focus on India and Pakistan, and you argue in the book that the post-independence political history of South Asia has really seen not one but two major cycles of national populist politics. Just tell us what those cycles kind of were. How do you think about them in both of these two countries?
Absolutely. So basically, the independence moment came with a lot of hope, and it came with a lot of hope of actually addressing and reversing the inequitable consequences of colonial rule. And what also happened in both India and Pakistan is that the colonial state essentially got transformed into the post-colonial state with somewhat limited revision. And so a lot of the inequitable practices, the exclusions, especially for farmers, for workers, for students who were not part of the sort of the golden sort of circles around kind of politics and civil society in both India and Pakistan. That led to a kind of a gigantic rupture on the part of Indira Gandhi and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who, as we talk about it, um, engaged reordering populist mobilizations based on new political parties. Indira Gandhi split Congress between the old Congress, which became Congress O or organization, and then the Congress I or the Congress R, which would turned into the Congress of Indira Gandhi. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto sets up the Pakistan People's Party and Mujibur Rahman as well in the Awami League in what would become Bangladesh. What happens in these populisms is a massive expansion of the scope of the state to intervene in the society, but especially the economy. And probably the most signature sort of policy was the nationalization of the finance industry, which meant that the state had a lot more power in determining and distributing resources. In both India and Pakistan in the 1970s, in the late 1970s, Indira Gandhi and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto engaged in fairly authoritarian modes of rule. Officially under Indira Gandhi, it was the emergency. In Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, it was again a kind of a turn towards authoritarianism, which ended abruptly, either in an election in India or in a military dictatorship in Pakistan. In the 1980s and 1990s, that massively engorged state fragmented into lots and lots of different interest groups, patronage networks, and forms of crony capitalism, which then created a circumstance in which some people were represented and received sort of the goods of the state, and then other people, notably middle class people outside of sort of networks of patronage, started protesting, and they protested first in social movements like Anna Hazare in India and Tahir ul Islam Qadri in Pakistan, but then were eventually incorporated into what we call these sort of additive populisms that are much more right-wing of Narendra Modi and Imran Khan. So that just sort of gives you a sort of a way, a kind of a capsuled political history of India and Pakistan that has populism as its theme.
You know, just to kind of recapitulate what you just said, Dan, is in India and in Pakistan, you locate the particular roots of the moral contract as kind of arising from this deeply inequitable nature of colonial domination, combined with the movements of liberation against that domination. And then those things together had an impact on kind of structuring, post-colonial politics. And what I find really interesting, and it's something that you both say explicitly, is that, and I just want to quote here, you say, at first glance, the idea that the first 2 decades after partition in Pakistan would be at all comparable to India seems strange, right? Because there are entire books been written, including by many of our friends, about the divergence between the two after the independence movement. So Pradeep, maybe I could just turn to you. When you step back and you think about it, what were the similarities that popped out to you as you were doing research for the book in two countries, which of course are neighbors, which of course, were birthed from the same empire, but in many ways, the political trajectories have described as divergent?
See, on the face of it, the divergence is really that Pakistan took a little bit longer to establish a constitution, number one. And number two, there were periods of military rule in Pakistan. But other than that, what is really striking if you read this period, and I would urge everybody to read, not read the book, of course, but just do your own independent work on this. The policies that both governments follow were actually remarkably consistent all the way through to the mid-70s. The way India conceived of community development and the way Pakistan conceived of rural development, the way they thought of national development. Of course, India went for a socialist model. Pakistan didn't for different reasons. Pakistan also didn't, get rid of the power of landlords. But a whole series of development policies they were following were identical. In fact, sometimes even the same phrases were used. And it was shocking to me when you read the history of India and Pakistan, you realize, especially the political economy, is that both countries were actually, and I'm going to say something which is going to get me in trouble, were not policy makers, but they were policy takers. The ideas were emanating from the West. And what both India and Pakistan were doing was adapting them almost identically with marginal shifts here and there. So to me, that was what is really remarkable about this. And in both cases, if you read Pranab Bharathan, what does he say in 1984? Who dominates India? The bureaucracy, the landlords, and the businessmen, and the political class. You could say exactly the same thing about Pakistan. Who does it exclude? It excludes small agriculture, it excludes working people, it includes small-scale industry across both countries. And once both Indira Gandhi and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto come to power, what do? They introduce policies to address the interests of small businessmen, agricultural classes who are not the zamindars in the case of Pakistan. But that's what they do. And to be blunt about this, Dan and I have talked about this. If we were more old-fashioned political economists, that's what we would have written, which is that what does the control of money do? All of a sudden, money can now be given out through by politicians to various groups. The small-scale industries corporation is set up in both countries. Agricultural banks are set up in both places to look after the interests of these groups of people. So in other words, we can look at the superficial. I'm not saying there are no regime differences, but the underlying political economy of both countries, the power of industry, the power of large landlords, the power of the political class, and the power of the bureaucratic class is more similar than different.
But go ahead, Dan.
And actually, I mean, just to continue on a favorite theme of ours, basically from the 1980s is again a period of divergence because Pakistan's under military rule and India is not. Um, uh, what you see in both cases, and that continues on into the 1990s, is now the political conflict is over capture of the state by different groups. Whether it's Nawaz Sharif's sort of Punjabi rich peasants and industrialists, or you're talking about the various forms of ethnic and caste-based political parties that are arising in India at that time. The idea is that what is happening is the impossibility of a truly class-based politics because everything is about capture and control of state resources for distribution. And that is a story that is very familiar to anyone who studies sort of Indian politics and listens to the podcast. The politics of distribution comes from that period. It's an outgrowth, an outcome of the dramatic left populist reordering populisms of Gandhi and Bhutto.
Hey, Grant the Masha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant the Masha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. But, you have these massive and massively consequential reordering populisms on the left in South Asia. And what you argue in the book is, look, ultimately, these did not transform either the state or society in a more socialist direction that would actually deliver equity and social justice for the most oppressed. It ultimately led to another crisis of representation, right? In India, for instance, you had political fragmentation, you had capture of state institutions, you had crony capitalism. They created another crisis of representation later on that, eventually gave rise to Mr. Modi. These were qualitatively different in your account than the crisis of representation that had been encountered, say, in the late 1960s. Tell us a little bit, if you would, and maybe Dan, I'll start with you. How was that crisis of representation that benefited Mr. Modi, that the BJP walked into, different from what, say, Indira Gandhi benefited from in the 1960s?
Yeah, so that's a great question. During Indira Gandhi was facing a much more widespread crisis of representation. Relatively few people were actually truly incorporated and represented in the system. And so her appeals were very, very broad, went out to every corner of the country, and in fact to lots and lots of different groups apart from the establishment. By the time we get to Narendra Modi, there are many, many discrete groups are actually represented by political parties, and political parties who are engaged in a process by which resources are taken from state capture and delivered to those groups. So to take an example, the Bahujan Samaj Party was benefiting certain Dalit groups, especially the Jatavs in North India. They were being represented, but there were other groups, other Dalit groups that were not being represented by the BSP. And similarly, so what we're seeing is a checkerboard or a patchwork of representation and non-representation. There's a particular group of people that are especially feeling unrepresented and capable of sort of moving forward in society without political connections. And those are the sort of lower middle class, or if you want, skilled working class strivers, people who, had listened to promises of economic liberalization, that they would be able to sort of become sort of successful in the new India. And all they see around them is their lack of political connections are preventing them from actually achieving the success that they would like compared to others with more political connections. So that becomes a group of people that are then open for mobilization. And so when Modi, who is, as um, as we all know, sort of a stalwart member of the Hindu nationalist movement, first in the RSS and then later on in the BJP, is able to fashion an appeal that can capture those upper caste Hindu nationalist voters, as well as this sort of larger group of sort of strivers and others who are looking at the system and seeing like their interests and their values are not being represented by the political system.
And actually, let me just say one thing about that, Milan. Thanks for the question, because I think what we write in the book, and I think we should take it back. Like, not my job to say this, but I want to be honest, is I think to say that it did not transform the state was perhaps a little bit too strong, because the state was working, as Dan just pointed out, for some people. And the thing is that that is why Modi succeeds, because there's a whole bunch of people for whom it is not working out. Whereas in the time of Indira Gandhi, the 1950s and 60s, a much, much larger section of society was actually left out. And that's why, and I think that is a difference. So I think, so to some extent, I think that statement was perhaps a little bit too strong, written in, let's say, the heat of the moment, shall we say.
Well, populism evokes passion,
Yes.
so heat of the moment is right. One of the things that really struck me from this book, and Pradeep, I want to ask you this question because you've written about this elsewhere, in fact, an entire book about it. A notable aspect of the middle classes in India and Pakistan who represent sort of the core constituencies for right of center populism is that they have high levels of religious belief and observance. And I wonder if you could just elaborate on that. And, is this something that is distinctive to South Asia or something that you think travels, across regions more broadly?
First, I think, I don't think this is distinctive to South Asia. I think this is, to some extent, you can see this in the United States as well. You can see this in Hungary as well. But I think there is a fundamental difference between, and I'll get to the Pakistan case as well in this here. I think there's a fundamental difference between how the BJP approaches the issue of religion and how this plays itself out in Pakistan as well. So in the Indian case, it is certainly true that the BJP has made an alliance between those who practice religion, practicing Hindus, as well as the, let's say, aggrieved middle classes and people in the business community and upper castes. But I think the other thing we need to keep in mind is that the BJP has been able to do this because one of the secrets of the RSS is that it actually doesn't engage in it doesn't favor any religious practice by itself. So I was interviewing or actually having a conversation with a very senior RSS leader. And I asked him about a statement the Shankaracharya of Puri had made. And his response was, we do not engage in matters concerning religious practice. Because religious practice is something that is for the religious people to decide. We don't get involved in those controversies because our job is to think of India and Hindu as one and the same thing, right? And not get bogged down by those religious controversies. So in some extent, I think while we focus on religious beliefs and religious practices, and I think all of us have, including me, and I think these religious beliefs and practices are indeed linked, maybe perhaps, to some kind of belief in religious nationalism, but I don't think there is a one-to-one correlation between the two at all. And that's why I think when the Congress party says that all of a sudden they're going to become religious and they start undertaking religious activities, the Congress Party's leaders, that's not going to get them any votes, because the secret of the BJP's success is religious nationalism. It is not religious beliefs by itself. And I think that is, a mistake I have made, and I think many of us make that mistake when we seem to think that those things are the same. Because it is, if you think about it for a moment, Milan, and you're an expert in this, well, there are thousands of religious practices in India. If the BJP or the RSS picks one or favors one, the consequences are not particularly good. They have to stay as far away from those as possible.
Yeah, so there's another dimension to this, which is, even if you want a little bit more visceral, which is that in India, and this is true in Pakistan too, there's a form of elite secular civil society that is associated with, major associations or institutions, as well as sort of buildings. So you can imagine the Delhi Gymkhana or the India International Center, which is essentially elite spaces that are not particularly welcoming of, for example, Hindi speakers or people who speak Punjabi, as opposed to Urdu, for example. And there's a way in which religion fosters a kind of a more inclusive civil society for people who are sort of excluded from these kind of elite establishment centers of civil society. The press association, the sort of elite sort of universities, for example. And so there's a way in which religion provides alternative spaces and forms of association that are really important for these kinds of the populist mobilizations.
I mean, one of the things that came up as you're talking about the more recent variants of populism in India that I found so interesting and somewhat counterintuitive is you have a line in the book where you say, at first glance, Narendra Modi is not a natural populist. And I think the reason this jumped out at me is because many observers feel that he is the kind of nationalist populist par excellence, right? I mean, he gets talked about in the same category as many other populist leaders. Even just recently in a column in the FT talking about the rise of populism, of course, Modi is prominently featured. But I'm curious, Dan, why don't you consider him to be a quote unquote natural populist?
If you place yourself in 2013 or 2014, and honestly, I've had the same question quite recently, which is, isn't he a Hindu nationalist? And he is. I mean, in some senses, Narendra Modi is one of the purest instances of a loyal foot soldier to the Hindutva political project. And normally when we talk about populists, and Imran Khan, I think we will get to a little bit later on, but Imran Khan is, or Donald Trump, for example, are people who are political outsiders. Whereas Narendra Modi has been a member of a partisan and ideological political formation since he was a young man, without any sort of distinctions, without any breaks, like, for example, AMLO in Mexico, who used to be a member of the PRI and then went to the PRD and then established his own political party. No, I mean, Narendra Modi has been BJP from RSS and then BJP from the very beginning. So I think from that point of view, he is actually quite unlikely as a populist, even though he definitely behaves sort of stylistically as a populist. So if you just think about it from the sort of party systems or party perspective, he's more unusual than not.
So, let's talk about Imran Khan for a second, because you note in the book that Khan's populist project failed once it achieved power. But what's so interesting to note, if we open up the newspapers or internet browser, is that there is an active attempt to rehabilitate him and to pave the way for his re-entry into politics. And that effort is also being echoed by people who are in the Trump orbit, saying that he is the Donald Trump of Pakistan and needs to be, back into political life. In the book, you note that, look, Khan retains significant support, and he may overcome these various obstacles that lie in his way. But his previous ability to assemble a broad coalition from different elements of Pakistani society, which of course is based on the promise of, restoring the moral contract, ending inequality, that ability is constrained. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit more, Dan, Pradeep, whoever would like to answer, why is it and how is it constrained?
I think the way it's constrained is, of course, he's in jail. So
pretty big constraint.
Yeah. So there is certainly a constraint. The other thing I think we need to keep in mind is that the genius of Narendra Modi, remember he contested the election in 2014 from Varanasi, is that Modi was able to capture the imagination of the Hindi heartland in a way where Imran Khan has not been able to capture the imagination of large swaths of Punjab and Sindh in Pakistan, which remain the most populous provinces. So I think there is that one difference, which means Imran Khan appeal starts in the frontier, right? Goes to Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, etc. He succeeds in Karachi, but struggles in rural parts of Sindh. So I think I think the demography of the appeal actually is a little bit different. The other thing which I think is ironically, two other things I think differentiate India and Pakistan. First, in Pakistan, the military remains an important player. And because the military remains an important player, it can set some constraints. It does set constraints on how far a political leader can go. And ironically, in India, because the security establishment is firmly in the hands of the Prime Minister, the Indian political class has a lot more leverage over the security establishment than the Pakistani politician has over the security establishment. So in other words, even if Imran Khan is a populist and comes to power, he cannot bend the state to the same extent as another populist can. The other final thing I think we need to think really hard about is that unlike Mr. Modi and the RSS, is that the Imran Khan identifies himself with a very particular religious sect, and he's engaged and therefore he finds himself in competition in some senses in a very crowded space where there are many other religious leaders who are representing their own particular religious perspectives. He has not been able in some senses to create, if you will, and as many of you have written, and you've written this as well, an ethnification of the Muslim identity, to the extent that the BJP has been able to create an ethnification of the Hindu identity. So I think those are the differences that place some constraints upon him, both the religious landscape, the control of the coercive instruments of the state, right, and the demography, which is where your support base lies.
Yeah, and let me just add to that just briefly by saying that his support base is very, very powerful in some of the major cities, which is one of the reasons, and these are often the people who are terminally online on Twitter or X, maybe even now Blue Sky, who knows, which gives him a larger political footprint, but neglects the fact that there are really very serious centers of representation among the PMLN, the PPP, some of the other political parties. So Imran Khan believes himself to be universally loved and someone who would naturally be able to sway a majority of Pakistanis, but he's never actually been able to win majorities either in the vote or in terms of seats, unlike Prime Minister Modi. But it is worth noting that the current establishment, the coalition government of the PDM, has not been actually able to solve any of the problems that led them to sort of come together in a coalition and force Imran Khan out of power. The economic situation in Pakistan is pretty dire. There's high inflation. And so as a result, in the election in 2024, Imran Khan affiliated independents, PTI affiliated independents, won the plurality of the seats, even though he was not able to achieve a majority. And he wasn't able to take power, first and most obviously because the security services and the military found that unacceptable, but also because he refused to go into coalition with any other political party, unlike, for example, the BJP going into the sort of natural, comfortable NDA coalition. And so as a result, Imran Khan has this other added constraint, which is that his inability to play with other political parties means that he can't actually construct this alternative majoritarian coalition.
So let me just end maybe by asking you both to reflect on one thing that you mentioned, I think, in the concluding chapter of your book. You write that many castigate populists for their failures in governance. We agree that populists are terrible at governance, but governance is not the point of the exercise. I sort of laughed out loud when I read that. So I guess that kind of raises this paradox, right? I mean, are they doomed to fail and essentially exacerbate the crisis they were elected to ostensibly solve? Pradeep, maybe I'll ask you that first.
I think the answer is yes. I think the short answer is yes, indeed, because the purpose of a populist promise comes to power promising that they will reform political inequality. If they don't do that, the crisis of representation will persist. And because the crisis of representation will persist, their normal tendency is not to work through institutions, but to centralize power. That only exacerbates the crisis, and therefore you can get caught in these cycles that move on. That you can get caught in these cycles. So my answer would be, the short answer is yes. And I just gave the reason why I think that's the case.
And I guess for me, it may call us to think about populism in a slightly different way, which is that populism can most usefully be seen as a symptom of underlying weaknesses in the way that democracies actually function. And so as a result, all of us, citizens, analysts, commentators, need to think long and hard about what causes populists to rise up. And if there are ways of managing representation and transforming the state and thinking about public policy from the point of view of equity and inequity first, rather than just thinking about sort of effectiveness, it might actually lead us to think about populism as a kind of a canary in the coal mine more than anything else.
My guests on the show this week are the political scientists Adnan Naseemullah and Pradeep Chhibber. Together, they are the authors of a new book, Righteous Demagogues, Populist Politics in South Asia and Beyond. Atul Kohli calls it an outstanding book. A persuasive and original argument, the book is a deft and much-needed comparison of India and Pakistan and offers broader insights into the global phenomena of populism. This book is a must-read. Dann, Pradeep, it was really a joy to read this book, get the chance to talk with you. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you very much, Milan.
Thank you so much, Milan. It was a great question. Thank you for the conversation.
Grand Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show, to support the work we do on Grand Tamasha, and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, grandtamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer. Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Additional assistance is provided by Annabelle Richter. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.